So last time we were talking about the Antebellum Reforms. We were talking about Dorothea Dix that promoted what two kinds of reforms? Mental health reform and prison reform, right? We talked about her trying to help out the common man, making that shift from treating prisoners and punishing them to actually helping prisoners with rehabilitation. We also talked about mental health reform and stopping to treat the mentally ill as criminals and starting to treat them as if they have a sickness. With regard to the Temperance Movement, we also talked about this movement mostly led by who? Mostly led by women. And this was a movement that really tried to reduce the consumption of what? Alcohol. You want to temper that consumption of alcohol. Here's two examples of just people trying to prevent this consumption of alcohol. And so two groups kind of emerged. You have the American Temperance Society and the Teetotalists. The American Temperance Society and Teetotalists were a little bit different. What was the difference between the American Temperance Society and the Teetotalists? So let's go with, okay, Vanessa. Right, so temperance means to reduce. Teetotalists is total elimination of alcohol, right? So just total elimination of alcohol. Again, how successful were they? A little successful, right? Because did they eliminate the consumption of alcohol? No, they did not. But were there some gains? Yeah. Did they reduce domestic abuse? Did they reduce divorce? Did they reduce unemployment? Yeah, so there was some progress with regard to the temperance movement. And again, was this a really good opportunity for women to get involved? Yeah, this really gave women that ability to really feel involved in society. So again, you can say that another benefit of the temperance movement was that women were socially involved, that women were socially involved. Women were socially involved. That it wasn't simply just them sitting back and just watching. They were actually getting involved in the temperance movement or the social reforms movement. So speaking of women, let's move on to the discussion of women in particular, because you may have an essay on women this time around. The changing role of women. So the role of women is going to change dramatically in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s. And first off, we're going to start off with this idea of the changing role of women in economics. Some of this you already know, but we're still going to put it all on one area so you guys could kind of focus your attention on specifically just women for now. So the change for women began, first off, with property rights. So before, did women have any property rights? So before, women had no property rights. Let's say you were a wealthy landowner. You had all this land that your grandparents had, and your parents died, and you were the only girl, so you inherited it. What happens when you get married? Your husband takes all of it. Let's say you were a person that worked for a living. You got wages. What happened once you got married? Let's say you kept working while you were married. Who controls all that money now? Your husband has all your wages. Even though you're the one who worked, your husband is the one who rightfully owns your wages, even though you worked. And so this is kind of messed up if you think about it, because you're the one working, it was your inheritance, and likely things will change. They won't change a lot yet, but they'll slowly change. So here's some of the changes. Number one, in this new era, women start to have more property rights. They're not equal to men, but you see an increase in property rights for women. Meaning that if a husband dies, a woman can inherit the land again. Versus before, when a husband dies, who gets the land? The son or the children. So now, there's a little bit more property rights for women here, which is good for them. Also, women get to keep their wages. They get to keep their wages. So before, when you got married, what happened to your wages? They were given to your husband. But now, with some new laws, you got to actually keep your wages. They were yours. Your inheritance was yours also. So you got to keep all things that were yours after you got married, which is a huge boost for women. Another change was the Lowell Mills. because of the lower mills, what do you start seeing happening in the American economy with regard to women? Yeah, more women are working. You see an increase in women workers. No longer are they just working at the home when they have free time. Are women actually having jobs, careers? So you see this change for women. And women are actually going to enter the field, and specifically, this was happening in the Lowell mills. Now, which women were getting hired, by the way? New England farmers' daughters. So just remember this. New England farmers' daughters being hired here. But once they started getting hired, did we start hiring Southern farmers' daughters and Southern wives and, like Southern farmers' cousins and whoever else and someone's grandma? We start hiring more people. And so you start seeing that kind of emerge at this time as women start entering the workforce. So that's also quite a large deal for women as they change in their role. You also see the feminization of jobs. What does that mean, folks? When jobs become feminized. Not simplified. That's a pretty derogatory term reflecting of women. No, it's not like that's a feminine job now. That's terrible. No. But really, literally, think of a job today that's perceived as being feminine. Secretaries. What else? Nurses, even teachers, right? Teaching is still considered a female profession for the most part. There are people like me that are trying to break into that mold. But for the most part, no, the teaching profession at the time was considered a female profession. First off, folks, who dominated the teaching profession? Before this time period, men dominated the teaching profession. Why?
They're wealthy.
Not just women were wealthy too. They were educated. They had more freedom. Were girls allowed to leave the home? No. Men were the ones who were supposed to make a living. So before, men were mostly teachers. Men were the ones going out and educating, likely, other men. But that changed with the feminization of jobs. Now women start dominating the teaching profession. What are other jobs, again, at this time, do you think that are dominated by the women? Nurses, or at least somewhat medical. And so again, you have teaching dominating that field. And you also have some famous authors. Some other women are becoming authors. Now, what class of women do you think are becoming authors? High to middle to high class women. Are common women becoming authors at this time? No, because they're still pretty illiterate. But is that still somewhat of a big deal? That women are now becoming authors? Many of them are writing for women's magazines. Now, by the way, how is it now possible that there are women writing for women's magazines? What's changing in society as a whole to allow for something like this to happen? Think about that for a second. What is happening in society for a job like being an author for a women's magazine to have happened? What had to have happened in America for something like that to have happened? Yeah, literacy had to go up, right? So you'll see this rise in literacy. We'll talk about that in a minute. But again, when you have women's authors, it's because you have a rise in literacy. But again, who's mostly buying these magazines? Women, and of what class? Middle, upper class. Common women, they probably still can't read yet. But the middle, upper class women, are they reading more? And that's still an improvement, because in the time, were there a lot of wealthy people that couldn't read? Yes, and so now you're trying to educate all of America. And so again, folks, are there a lot of changes for women here economically? The major shift is from what? What were they doing before all of this? Just staying at home. And so it's a major shift in the role of women in the economy. Now they have more property rights. They're now working even more so. They're working specifically in teaching. And a lot of women are becoming writers. So you have this massive shift in actual economics of women. A lot of women are also writing about social reform. So in these magazines that they're writing about all these social reforms that need to happen. So who might be writing an article, for example, about social reform? Dorothea Dix. You might be like, oh, mental health is such an issue in America today. We all should go and change it. So Dorothea Dix was a really good example, again, of promoting this idea of social reform in the magazines. Another changing role for women was the domestic role of women. What are we talking about here? We're talking about domestic role of women, role of women at home. We're talking about the role of women at home. So first off, let's go way back. Republican motherhood. What was the idea behind Republican motherhood? Daniele, what is the idea behind Republican motherhood? You want to take a stab at it? Republican motherhood, what does that mean? What is the role of women with Republican motherhood? Raise their kids right, but raise them to be good what? Good citizens. So the idea of the Republican motherhood was that first, once this country was started, make sure your kids are good citizens. That was first and foremost their major responsibility, to raise good citizens. And then that responsibility began to change. And then they said, it's not just raising good citizens anymore. By the way, that was about the 1790s when that happened. But it begins to shift, and all of a sudden you start seeing the rise of the cult of domesticity. In the 1800s, you see the rise of this notion of the cult of domesticity. And what the cult of domesticity did was that it glorified the woman. It held the woman up as the housewife and the homemaker. But the cult of domesticity glorified women as the housewife or the mother of the home. That was their role. And it wasn't demeaning either. It was like, women, you play such an important role in society. You are the mother of our children and you take care of the home. And was this seen as somewhat equal to the role that men played? Like, women dominated the home sphere. Women dominated the home while the men dominated what? Work. So women's sphere of influence was the home, while the men's sphere of influence was work. And that was the role that women were expected to play. You are now the perfect housewife, and that is what is expected of you. And we're going to glorify you as that being. Now, we're not going to give you the right to vote, and we can still legally beat you, and you really don't have very much property rights, but you are amazing. There's no right to vote. But hey, thank you for your contributions to society. And so this is this new notion of women, that they have to be the perfect mother. In fact, this was known as the cult of true womanhood. Because you kind of hear this today also. What do they say about working women? What is the thought that comes across some people's minds, like when a woman works and she has kids? Oh, like you're abandoning your kids to go to work? I mean, how often do they ask that about men? Oh, you're going to abandon your kids to go to work? They don't ask that about men, but the question is asked of women all the time. If a woman wants to work, like, oh, you're such a bad mother. But when a guy works, like, oh, you're such a great dad, providing for your children. So there's a double-sided expectation here. And so the expectation was that women were supposed to be at home, that women shouldn't work, that the cult of true womanhood meant a woman that stayed at home. It meant a woman that did not work. They had to be submissive to their husbands. So like, hey, I'm the man, you do what I say because I work really hard. And so this is the idea of the cult of domesticity. It begins in the 1800s and it goes in and out of fashion in America every like 30, 40 years. So it'll come back in a while. But in any case, you have that going on. And some of the things that promoted the cult of domesticity is Godey's Ladies' Book. So this is this is a front cover of Godey's Ladies' Book. And the idea was that this are tips about how to be a good wife, like how to make sure you please your husband and make sure that he's happy when he gets home, and how you make sure that the clothes are clean at the end of the day, and how to raise your kids, and how to look nice and pretty when he comes home, that kind of stuff. That's what you were reading. How to be submissive and meek in the face of your husband. So that was the expectation. So that is the other changing role of women in the domestic household. Going from, hey, be a good citizen, to, hey, Do the housework. Don't worry about that. But everyone kind of have a basic idea of what's happening with the role of women, though. Women are now being expected to stay in the household. That is what is expected of them. But there's also going to be a massive change in the politics of women. So, the changing role of women politically. Because is there kind of a backlash to this cult of domesticity? Were women okay with this role that was expected of them? Like, hey, all you do is you stay at home, and that's it. No freedom, no right to vote. You stay at home, you do your job because it's important. Your job is important. Well, a lot of women did rebel, and what I really like about this cartoon here is that a woman's writing on the wall that says, women's sphere is, and it used to be, the home. But she crosses that out. She says, the woman's sphere is wherever she makes good. And then she wants it now to be maybe the home. It could still be the home, but the law, industry, school, the stage, business, the arts. I mean, the expectation being made here is that what can women do? Everything and whatever they want. And could they also be a housewife? Yes, so understand here, folks, the women's rights movement that we're going to talk about in a second was not suggesting that women should not stay at home. It's suggesting that women should have a choice. And if they choose to be a housewife, is that also okay? That's kind of the idea. And so, again, folks, you have Republican motherhood beginning with politics. But this will shift to the women's rights movement. Before, it was just, hey, make sure your children become good citizens. But eventually, women begin to recognize that, I need to be a good citizen. I need to play a role in my society. So you have the emergence of the women's rights movement and the fight for women's suffrage. So again, what is women's suffrage? Women's right to vote. So make sure you guys are aware that when we're talking about women's suffrage, we're talking about women's right to vote. So if you're ever at like the LA County Fair and someone's trying to get you to sign a petition that says, we all should end women's suffraging. They're suffraging so much. It's terrible how much they're suffraging every single day. Don't get confused and assume that they mean suffering. Because if you sign that petition, you're trying to take away women's right to vote. Don't do that. So women's suffrage is women's right to vote. Cool? Okay. So here's what women try to do to get that right to vote. Because again, they're trying to fight against that cult of domesticity. Number one, you have your leaders. So many famous leaders of the time who are now fed up are first Susan B. Anthony. You know Susan B. Anthony? On the coin, yeah, dollar coin. Susan B. Anthony. Susie B. Susan B. Anthony. Also, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. These three are considered the major leaders of the women's rights movement. They are considered to be the major leaders of the women's rights movement. In fact, in their leadership, they create an organization known as the National Women's Suffrage Association. National Women's Suffrage Association. They should call it the National American Women's Suffrage Association. The National Americans Women's Suffrage Association. The other name for it is NASA. NAWSA. The National American Women's Suffrage Association. And what were they fighting for? Women's suffrage. They're fighting for women's rights. All four of them, yes, but Elizabeth Blackwell was a little bit different. But again, they all fought for women's rights, and they also fought for women's equality. There's always two things here, folks. Women's rights and women's equality, and again, women's right to vote. So you have women's rights, women's equality, and women's right to vote. Now, Elizabeth Blackwell also helped them in the women's rights movement. But Elizabeth Blackwell is also pretty unique, because Elizabeth Blackwell was the first what? She's the first female doctor in the United States. She went to Harvard, and she's the first female doctor in the United States. So Elizabeth Blackwell, who also believed in women's rights, was also the first female doctor who you should know. By the way, the two women's rights leaders are definitely Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Lucretia Mott was also significant, but Stanton and Anthony are the most important ones. But Elizabeth Blackwell is the first female doctor in America. Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell made people feel well. So she's a doctor that made people feel well. Blackwell, feel well, doctor. Good there? So they're trying to fight for women's rights. Another famous person that tried to fight for females' rights or women's rights was Amelia Bloomer. Amelia Bloomer is also important because she refused to have to wear what was expected of women. So she refused to wear, not women's clothing. She refused to wear dresses. Let's put it that way. She refused to wear dresses, long dresses anyway, and instead she wanted to wear short skirts and pants, also known as what? Bloomers. You know when girls wear those tight long pants or whatever? They're called bloomers. Those are bloomers. Named after her. She said, I don't want to wear long dresses anymore. Men get to wear pants. Why shouldn't women? And so you see the rise of bloomers. Another you should know is Margaret Fuller. And she wrote a book known as Women in the 19th Century. Women in the 19th Century. And in the book, Women in the 19th Century, she protested against the cult of domesticity. She protested against the cult of domesticity, saying, this is a terrible idea. She protested against the cult of domesticity because she suggested that if women were expected to stay at home and men were allowed to work, it was almost as if we were treating women like what? Not so much like slaves, but as second-class citizens. She said that the cult of domesticity relegated women to the notion of being second class to men, when in reality, women were supposed to be what? Equal to men. And she said, no, that's not okay. In fact, she advocated a few things that are still pretty controversial today. But she was doing this back in 1820. A few of the things that she promoted, folks, included advocating or promoting the idea of divorce. She said that women should have the right to have a divorce, or divorce by women. Because one thing that you guys need to know is that women were not allowed to give themselves divorces. Only men could divorce their wives. So even if you had an abusive relationship, a woman was not allowed to divorce her husband unless she went to the court and the judge could prove, or she could prove to the judge that the husband was abusive. Otherwise, a woman could not divorce her husband just because she was unhappy. Which is kind of messed up if you think about it. But that's the way it was back then. Women were not allowed to have a divorce. So she said women should have a divorce if they want, if they're unhappy. The other thing, and here's the crazy one, is that she also promoted the idea of birth control. She advocated the idea of birth control. We're not talking about the pill yet, because the pill doesn't exist yet. There's no birth control pills yet. But she's talking about, again, the condoms, diaphragms, sponges, whatever else. The basic old-fashioned stuff that you use since, like, the Celtic times. But she advocated the use of birth control because she said, look, men can sleep around whenever they want, and there's almost an expectation that women can't, which is a double standard that's not fair. But really what it should be was that she advocated the idea of birth control because she said that women should have kids by choice, not by what? Not by chance. Women should have kids by choice, not by chance. Because again, getting pregnant is still pretty unpredictable whether you're trying or not. And so she said women should have a choice in the matter about whether to have kids, and they said women should have kids by choice and not by chance. Because if you just get pregnant randomly whenever, can you set up a career plan for yourself? Can you plan ahead for your future? No. And yet men don't have that same kind of inhibition. They can do whatever they want because if someone gets pregnant, it's not going to be them. And so they said that same expectation should be allowed for women, where women should be allowed to have kids by choice and not by chance. And that idea of birth control, folks, is a huge change. Very controversial. Few people will actually do it, but still. Controversial, but the idea is there now. Questions there? No? Okay. The other woman that's not on the slide is Lucy Stone. Lucy Stone refused to take her husband's last name, so she wanted to keep her maiden name, which is a big deal, right? Lucy Stone refused to take her husband's name, and she wanted to keep her maiden name because she wanted to stay Lucy Stone. And so all were like, wow, I can't believe you're doing that. That's such a big change. That makes you so much more powerful. So all the women that followed her were known as the Lucy Stoners. So they were the Lucy Stoners. My fiance is going to take my last name because it's kind of a cool last name. So King. I mean, it's pretty awesome. I mean, I can't blame her. It's pretty cool.
What's your last name?
Her first name is Kelly. Yeah, and her middle name is Camille. So I'm like, but it's with a C, not a K, because otherwise, that would be terrible. But now, luckily, we missed that one. But otherwise, we're good there. So here's, folks, between that cult of domesticity and the political movement. Women in the women's rights movement here were tired of being expected of doing only this. Did women want to get more involved? Yeah. Women wanted to take more of a political role. They said, why should I just stay at home all day when I could go out, vote? I mean, sure, the sign says down with men, and I don't think it's a bit much. But still, the idea is that women should be playing more of a role in politics and not just sitting at home. In 1848, big day. In 1848, we had the Seneca Falls Convention. In 1848, this is in New York, Seneca Falls, New York. But we had the Seneca Falls Convention, which is the first women's rights convention. And at the Seneca Falls Convention, which is the first women's rights convention, what do you think they wanted? They wanted women's rights, the right to vote, property rights, equality for men and women. So again, vote, equality, rights. So they all met in New York to discuss how they decided to have rights. Now here's the ironic thing about this. Who mostly attended the Seneca Falls Convention, which was a convention for women's rights? Men. Why couldn't women go? Because their husbands would not allow them. Like, I'm not going to... Wait, you want to go to a conference in which you want to be eaten? No, you can't go. So, fathers, husbands, brothers did not let their wives, sisters, mothers go. But were some women still in attendance? Because were there some families that were already kind of progressive, like, oh, of course, women should be equal to men, and the father was like, yes, do that. And so there were some women in attendance, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, all those people we mentioned. And they attended, and by the way, this was organized by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So you should know it's organized by those two. But it was mostly men in attendance. Some men came in support. Other men came just to be jerks. Like they would say, we have a room full of women here, and they might as well be women supporting women. Men who might as well be women supporting women. And you're suggesting that women should have the right to vote? What's next? Letting cows vote? This is literally something that they said at that convention. They believed that if it was so ridiculous to let women vote that we might as well equate it to letting cows vote. It was just as dumb of an idea to let cows vote as it was to let women vote. That's how they felt about it. And a lot of men were angry, like, who's going to raise the children? Why is no one thinking of the children? You have a role, we have a role. Women can't just go and join politics. They're the fairer sex. They won't be able to handle it. They thought they were protecting women. Women can't vote. They have smaller brains. It's science. Back then, science did say that women had smaller brains because science was dumb. Not very educated back then. But in any case, at this convention, they demanded equality. They wanted women's right to vote. And what ends up coming out of Seneca Falls is something known as the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments. It was something that came out of the Seneca Falls Convention, was the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments, sometimes just known as the Declaration of Sentiments. And what this was the women's declaration of their rights. It was a declaration of rights. So I'm going to read it to you right now, and then you tell me what it sounds like. Okay? We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights governed are instituted deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. So, different already? What's the major difference here? Women. All men and women. The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. So again, sounds a lot like what? The Declaration of Independence. But instead of talking about the tyranny of a king, they're talking about the tyranny of who? Tyranny of man over women. He has made her, if married, in the eye of the law, civilly dead. Because once they're married, he pretty much owns her. She no longer exists. She is a part of him now. Does that make sense? He has taken from all right in property, even to the wages she earns. Terrible. He has made her morally an irresponsible being, as she can commit many crimes with impunity, provided they be done in the presence of her husband. Here's the crazy one. You as a woman were allowed to commit a crime so long as your husband allowed you to do it. Well, the husband could go to jail, but you as a woman, you didn't know any better because you're a woman. It's a strange concept to suggest that, oh no, it's not your fault. Your husband made you do it, and you had to do it. So your husband will go to jail, but not you, because you're stupid. There's nothing that you could do to prevent it. In the covenant of marriage, she is compelled to promise obedience to her husband, and he becoming, to all intents and purposes, her master. The law giving him power to deprive her of her liberty and to administer chastisement. Chastisement means that he's allowed to what? To chastise her means he's allowed to what? To beat her. He's allowed to beat her. Legally. He's allowed to beat his wife. Like, men will be men. That's what the concept was. Like, well, that's a husband's right. And so that was the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments. Are women really trying to change society for themselves? They're really trying to fight for their right to vote, especially with the Declaration of Sentiments. This doesn't go anywhere. In 1848, they have the convention, they try, but women still won't get the vote. I mean, it's 1848, right? Women still won't get the vote until 1920. So there's some time until women will earn the right to vote. But have they begun the process? And that's the important part. America's not ready to give women the right to vote. Yes, sir. Sure. Ultimately, the women's right to vote, or the women's movement, will fail. But the major reason why the women's rights movement will fail is because they become concerned with other things. And primarily, what do they become distracted by? Not Civil War, but abolition, slavery, and the Civil War. So the reason why it takes until 1920 is that women become distracted by the issue of slavery and the Civil War. Because what they looked at was, look, yes, women should have the right to vote, but those people need to be freed. And that might be even more important. And so a lot of women that want to focus their time on women's rights decide to focus their attention on slavery instead. Does that make sense? And so it's not that they didn't have the power behind it, it's that they got distracted by other issues. Dorothea Dix, women's health reform, temperance, this. I mean, there's a lot of things happening in society. So when you're pulled by like 90 different things, can you really focus on the one? No, that's what happened here. Everyone good on politics then? About how women changed in politics? Yeah. More of a role? Awesome. Let's talk about education reform. They're led by this guy. That is Horace Mann. And Horace Mann was an educator that society decided that we should move towards tax-supported education. Or tax-supported public education. Here's why this is important. Before, who could only go to school? Why could only the rich go to school? Because they could pay for it. They could afford it. So who couldn't go to school? Common. Because was school free back then? Absolutely not. But what society and really the upper classes decided was, we probably should change that. Because I, as a business owner, wealthy business owner, what do I want from my workers? I want them to be at least somewhat educated, right? Because hey, you're going to have to work this machine. Here's a manual. I can't read. Well, that's a problem. So is it better to have an educated workforce? So what they promoted was the idea of tax-supported public education. And the idea was that this education would be what? It would be free. It began the idea of a free public education supported by taxes. And who paid a lot of that tax? The wealthy. We as the common people still pay taxes, but the wealthy fronted most of the money for these public schools. They wanted free public education because, again, folks, what did the upper class want? Why do they want more education in America? They wanted educated workers. They wanted educated workers. That's one of the major reasons why we did it. They wanted an educated workforce. Well, one of the things that we did then to promote a more educated workforce was they separated schools by grades. They separated schools by grades. You see, folks, way back when, the way school would work is we'd have a building just like this, and kids from K through 8 would be in the exact same room. And I would just teach the exact same lesson every year for 8 years. and the older kids would just be better at it, and the younger kids would be new to it, and that was school. All right, guys, we're going to spell some words again. The word is hog. Okay, who could spell hog? Okay, Billy, I know you know the answer. You've been here for 7 years now. I'm asking Cindy. You spell hog. And so it wasn't a very good education back then because was it focused? It was a lot of just repetition, memorization over and over again. It wasn't a very good education. The other problem was that most teachers were untrained. Most teachers were untrained, and so that was a problem. Oh, and you weren't required to go to school. There was no mandatory attendance. You could just go to school whenever you want. Is that a problem? Yeah, if you're in the middle of a lesson, you leave for 3 months and you come back, you'd be like, oh, you guys are in letter T now? I only learned up to letter G. I'm never going to learn how to read. And so that's a problem. And so, because of all these problems, Horace Mann here said we should fix schools. So what he did was a few things. Number one, he introduced teacher training schools. Horace Mann introduced teacher training schools. He introduced teacher training schools. You know, where you train teachers to teach? You have to teach teachers to teach? Yep. I do that. Yes?
Is there a school based on him?
Likely. Yeah, like reform school. Yeah. There's lots of them. But yeah, you teach teachers how to teach. So I do that a few times a year at Claremont Graduate. They also divided classes by grades. They divided classes by grades. So, you know, you wouldn't have to learn how to do the alphabet again. You feel really confident. Like, I got this alphabet. Watch. A, B, C. Let me start over. A, B. So, they also introduced a principal. Or a principal to the school. Because who used to run the school?
No one.
No, someone ran it before. The teacher. But what was the problem with the principal or teacher running the school and teaching? Can they focus on teaching? No. So the idea was, let's introduce a principal.
But wasn't it just like the schoolhouse?
Yeah, but someone else has to manage the money, the finances, whatever else, by the books. And so the idea was that the teacher could focus on teaching, and someone could, like, buy the wood for the stove so they don't freeze to death in the winter and all that other stuff. So the principal was supposed to, like, manage everything, and the teacher could just teach. The principal might go and find the kids if they didn't show up to school, that kind of thing. And he introduced textbooks, formal textbooks, because back then it was just like, what do you want to learn today? Whatever. And then the teacher would just come up with the stuff on their own. But the problem is, what they're learning in one school, is it going to be the same as what they're learning in another school? No. So what they did was they introduced something called McGuffey Readers. McGuffey Readers. And McGuffey Readers were the first textbooks. They were very simple. They looked just like this. Like, here's a McGuffey Reader, and here's one of the pages where it was just lessons about how to use the letter O and U in sentences. Or like hog, log, sod, bod, fox, locks, docks, rocks, that kind of thing. Socks. Vend, bend, tend, lend, mend, spend. That kind of stuff. So again, this is a McGuffey Reader. So, are they improving education? The important part is they provided free public education. That's the big deal. And the impact of this, here's a McGuffey Reader. The impact was that you had an increase in literacy. I mean, across the country, you had an increase in literacy. And how do we know that? Because you have more newspapers being published. And what does it suggest if more and more different newspapers are being published in America? More people can read. So be aware that you guys are able to draw that correlation with a graph like this. If you see a lot of people publishing newspapers, that likely means that more people can read, and that's a somewhat big deal. So be aware of that. If more people can read, folks, does that mean that more people will participate politically? Sure, so you have higher political participation because people can read. So that's a plus. Good there? Reading. It's important. This was successful, folks, because by 1860, 94% of Northerners could read, and 83% of Southerners could read. This is a pretty big change from 20 and 11% from before. That's a huge change. We went from 94% in the North and 83% in the South, and that was a major shift from 20 and 11% before. Yes, so this is a change in literacy. Oops. This is a change in the literacy rate. So, was public education successful? Most definitely. A lot more people could read. Hooray! That's always a plus. Other concerns of education? Women educators that you should know? You should know Mount Holyoke. Led by Mary Lyon. Mount Holyoke was the first what? Take a guess. First women's college. Very good. It's first women's college. I highly recommend women's colleges if you haven't considered them before, ladies. My fiance went to a women's college, and she's awesome. Mount Holyoke College was the first women's college. And Troy Seminary School was the first all-girls school, led by Emma Willard. Cool. Okay. Let's talk about abolition. We're not going to spend too much time on abolition today because we have a whole unit on this coming up on Thursday or later today, depending on how we are with time. But abolition is also quite critical to this idea of the Antebellum Reforms because abolition is what we spent most of our time on. Here you see on this coin, what does it read here, folks? Am I not a man and a brother? Again, pleading, why am I not treated like a human being? Why am I treated simply like property? So we'll get more into the details of slavery in Unit 5, but you should already know that slavery is bad. If you don't know that, wow. But Abolition Movement was, again, the movement to try to abolish slavery. Here's what happened with slavery, folks. 1 dot equals 200 slaves. And what happened with the growth of slavery is that here's how it was, and then here's how it grew by 1860. So here's what slavery was like in 1820, and then slavery by 1860. So it grew pretty dramatically in this time period. And again, there was almost like there was no stopping it. And we really did feel like slavery should end. And so you see the rise of the abolition movement. Here's an example of an abolitionist alphabet book. It says abolition. A is for abolitionist, a man who wants to free the wretched slave and give to all an equal liberty. B is a brother with a skin of a darker hue, but in our heavenly Father's sight he is as clear as you. C is the cotton field to which this injured brother's driven, when as the white man's slave he toils from early morn till even. Doesn't really rhyme very well. D is the driver cold and stern who follows whip in hand to punish those who dare to rest or disobey command. So again, the idea was that let's teach young children about the evils of slavery so when they grow up, they could be abolitionists too. Cool? Okay. And so, some famous abolitionists that you should know. Angelina and Sarah Grimke, the Grimke sisters. They were abolitionists. They tried to end slavery. Yay. Yeah.
Is this George who's the one who
That's correct. Sojourner Truth was another famous abolitionist. She was an escaped slave. She was an escaped slave that taught herself to read and write. She actually changed her name. I forget what her original name was. I forget her original name. I want to say it's like Christine or something. But she changed her name to Sojourner Truth because anyone know what the word sojourn means when you go on a sojourn?
Doesn't that mean isn't it something like?
Well, look at the word. Look at the word itself. What does it look like?
Journey.
Journey. So you go on like a quest or a journey. And so what is she going on a quest for? Truth. She's going on a journey for truth. So she changed her name to Sojourner Truth because she's a woman that wanted to, spend her life looking for truth in God and whatever else. So she changed her name. But one of the famous things that she wrote was that she actually attended Seneca Falls Convention.
What was her real name?
Again, I don't remember what her... She changed her name. This became her new name. I don't remember what her original name was, but this became her new name, her official name. But I don't really remember what her... Because she had a slave name. Again, it was like Christine or something. I don't remember. Maybe even Rebecca. But she changed it to Sojourner Truth because when she freed herself, she wanted to give herself a name that wasn't the name that she had when she was a slave. Like, I'm free now. I want a name that resembles that I am. So she gave herself a new name. But she attended the Seneca Falls Convention at that women's rights convention, and she gave a very famous speech called Ain't I a Woman? How many of you are familiar with the speech Ain't I a Woman? Okay. So the speech Ain't I a Woman that she gave at the Seneca Falls Convention was a bit interesting because it wasn't a plea for women's rights. What it was a plea for black women. Because what happened in society was that there was an expectation that black women weren't feminine, that they were black. And almost the idea that the fairer skins were the ones that were more feminine than the others. She said, no, ain't I a woman? Don't I bleed and have children just as much as you? Don't I care for, my fellow sisters and brothers? Don't I weep when my children die? Don't I love a man just as you? Ain't I a woman? And so the basic argument she was making in Ain't I a Woman was this plea that, one, she was a human being, not just a slave, but two, she was just as feminine as all these other women. That she wasn't any less feminine just because she was black. That she was a woman just as them. And so Ain't I a Woman became a very famous speech that she gave at the Seneca Falls Convention. At least that part that you need to know. Harriet Tubman is also a very famous abolitionist. What did Harriet Tubman do? She managed the Underground Railroad. Good. And what did she do with the Underground Railroad? She helped slaves escape. In fact, folks, she freed over 300 slaves on her own. And she went down into the South 19 times. Each time did she risk her life. Each time they said, we're going to kill her the next time we find her. And she went down 19 times to free slaves. That's pretty bold and brave of her to do. Because most of you are like, I'm not even going down one time. Because that's terrifying. But she went down 19 times to free these people as part of the Underground Railroad. So very famous. In fact, folks, the nickname that she was given was the Moses of her people. Her nickname is the Moses of her people because she freed her own people. But 300 slaves. Also, because she was part of the Underground Railroad, what title do they give people that operate the Underground Railroad? She's a conductor. The conductor of the Underground Railroad. Like a train conductor of the Underground Railroad. Cool. So are women playing a large role in abolition as well? Certainly. Here again, folks, is the Underground Railroad. What was, by the way, the end stop of the Underground Railroad? Where were they supposed to go? What was the end of the Underground Railroad? Where was it? North where? Canada. The end of the Underground Railroad was Canada. Why not in, like, Massachusetts or New York? Could they still be caught and returned? Yeah, so they didn't end in America because they could still be returned as slaves. But the end of the road was Canada. That was the goal. An organization that did try to end slavery was an organization called the American Colonization Society. Pretty much what they wanted to do, established in 1816, was to send slaves back to Africa. This is part of the first Back to Africa movement. And the expectation was, hey, these guys are black. You know where they should go? Back to Africa. But not like, let's send these people back to Africa where they belong. It's like, no, they'd probably like it if we sent them back to Africa with like their friends and people that look like them. This is probably what they want. And so the American Colonization Society wanted to send blacks back to Africa. So here was their plan. Number one, they were going to buy slaves. And then two, they're going to ship them to Africa. In fact, they even bought a country in Africa where all these free slaves could go. It was called Liberia. You know, named after what? Liberty. Freedom. So they even, you know the country of Liberia today? In Africa? That was created by anti-slavery Americans creating a new colony for free slaves. It still exists today as Liberia. The capital of which is Monrovia, named after who? President Monroe. Anyway, this failed. Here's why. Number one, slave owners refused to sell their slaves. Like, I'm not going to sell you my slave. You have like $30,000? I'll sell you my slave then because that's how much my slave is going to make. So you give me $30,000, I'll sell you my slave. But they said, we don't have that much money. Problem. So one, slave owners refused to sell. Two, it was really expensive to ship slaves to Africa or free slaves back to Africa. But the third problem was what? Yeah, blacks didn't want to go back to Africa. They're like, why would I want to go to Africa? I was born here. I don't know anyone in Africa. My family has been here for generations. Since like the 1700s. I speak English. My name is David. I wouldn't know what I would do if I went to Africa. And so many slaves said, that's crazy. I might be black, but I'm a black American. I'm not African American. I've been raised here for several years. And the problem is if we send them back, I'm like, hey, you can go back to your people now and put them in the middle of a jungle, they'd be like, great. Now what? Because they don't know how to live in that climate. They don't know how to work with that food. They'd have to be trained again. So they said, I would rather just be free and move to Louisiana, please. Can we do that? They said, no. It's back to Africa. Eventually, this failed. Why did they fail, folks? No one wanted to go, and they had no money. But they tried, and they meant well. They weren't like mean people. They're like, oh, you want to go back to your people, right? They're like, no. Now, some people did. They did send, I don't know the exact number, it was like 13,000 people or something. A lot of people did go back, but not everyone, not all 4 million. So, yeah. The other anti-slavery society you should know is the American Anti-Slavery Society, led by this guy, William Lloyd Garrison. Very famous abolitionist, William Lloyd Garrison. And he said, I am tired of waiting to end slavery. He demanded immediate abolition without compensation. He said, I demand immediate abolition of slaves without compensation. What does that mean, without compensation? And we're not going to pay you to free your slaves. Why should you free your slaves? Because it's the right thing to do. Yeah, you pay thousands of dollars for them, but I don't care. It's the right thing to do. You should free your slaves. It's bad. That's his argument. You should free your slaves because it's bad. You're going to pay for your slaves? No, I'm not going to pay anything for your slaves. But you should free them because it's the right thing to do. And he demanded immediate abolition of slavery. He wrote a newspaper in order to promote abolition called The Liberator. And one of his more famous quotes is, "I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." I will not give up on this idea of slavery. I'm not going to meet you halfway. I'm not going to let you have part of something. I am not going to retreat. I will be heard, and you will free your slaves. They did it, by the way. They did not free their slaves until much later. But that was his philosophy, that slaves should be freed right now. We shouldn't compensate them like the American Colonization Society. And again, abolition is one of those other famous things happening at this time. Questions there? We'll talk more about abolition later. Here they are trying to cut down that abolition tree. They're trying. It breeds brutality, lust, traffic in the souls of men, oppression, cruelty, treachery, adultery. Slavery is just bad, so they're trying to cut it down. The last thing we're talking about then today, folks, are utopian communities. Almost done. Almost done. Yeah. So what are utopian communities? Perfect societies. So we're going to talk about
Thank you. I'll bring it right back.
perfect societies. And so, make sure you come back to pick up your study guides if you're gone forever. Let's talk about the first one. The Shakers. Oh, yeah. The Shakers were founded by a woman named Mother Ann Lee. Not to be confused with Father Stanley of Marvel. Mother Ann Lee. Now, Mother Ann Lee and the Shakers tried to promote a very Christian society. Heavily Christian society. And pretty much what they ultimately believed in was that men and women were equal, so they believed in gender equality. Men and women were equal. And they also practiced the notion of celibacy. Celibacy. What's celibacy? No sex. Not allowed. Not even if you're married. No sex. Not allowed to have sex in this utopia. They said sex was distracting, it wasn't allowed, it was a sin of the devil. So the idea was that equality, gender equality, and celibacy. Yes, sir. Is that guy a short person? That's correct. And so, they believed in celibacy, they believed in gender equality. It was a very Christian society, and the reason why they were called Shakers is because of the way that they dance. You know, they were very big on dancing and shaking and whatever else. Here they are doing Thriller. And again, it's a very important movement that they had. The hard part about this society is what, though? How are they going to grow?
No babies.
They can't have children. So they have to, recruit new members. The surprising thing is they exist for about 90 years, guys. They last for a really long time. Like, hey, you want to join my cult? Oh, what's about? Oh, we don't have sex. Oh, yeah, I'll do that. That seems like something I want to do for the rest of my life. And they did that for, a really long time. And eventually society does kind of just say, I'm not going to do that anymore. So that's the Shakers. They tried, but they failed.
What happened if they got caught?
They would get kicked out. I mean, it's like a small community of this utopia, and they would live in the northwest and the rural areas. And if they were caught doing things they were not supposed to, they would kick them out. Sorry, man, you really don't believe in the word, and then they would kick them out. Another group was known as New Harmony. New Harmony was another utopia. And New Harmony was created by a guy named Robert Owen. This was a non-religious utopia. It was a non-religious utopia that was based on the idea of, honestly, socialist community. It was really a socialist community. It's pretty much communism without it being called communism. They didn't know it was communism. But pretty much the idea of this socialist community was that everyone shared everything. It was a communal ownership of all things. And so it wasn't the strongest society in the world, but it did promote communal ownership of property. They raised their kids in a community. We all shared raising of children. Again, it was a socialist community. One of the biggest things is that the people owned all the property together. The people owned all the property together. The problem, though, the reason why this is going to fail, is that are people kind of greedy? Yeah, and so if we say, oh, we're all going to share things equally, the odds of that going to be ending well is not going to be ideal. Like, if you and I were considered equal, like, but I work more. Like, doesn't matter. You're equal. You get the same bed, same chair, same desk. It doesn't really pan out for people. So this fails because people are inherently greedy. So, oh well, there. Then you have the Oneida. The Oneida, led by John Humphrey Noyes. They were a Christian society, but they rejected traditional relationships. They were a Christian society that rejected traditional relationships. They promoted free love. You know, multiple partners, sleep with whomever you want, that kind of thing. They promoted eugenics. But they rejected traditional relationships, and they promoted the idea of free love, which means just sleep with whomever, whenever. You don't have to sleep with the same person. But they also believed in the idea of eugenics. Anyone know what eugenics is? Eugenics is the idea of selecting parents to produce superior offspring or superior children. So they'd be like, hey, you're strong and you're strong, go have a baby. And you're attractive and you're attractive, go have a baby. And then when you have babies, we'll have a strong, attractive baby. That's eugenics. Like, you genetically try to breed the most superior being. That's what Hitler tried to do. It's eugenics. It's using genes to try to produce a superior offspring, superior being. They did that for a while. They did pretty well for themselves. They mostly made silver products. Bear traps, utensils, that kind of thing. Eventually, the society will fail, though, because there's a lot of just negative press. Because people are like, whoa, I don't want to live next to the community that has all the crazy sex parties. So they complain and complain and complain, and eventually the Oneida Society collapsed. But they still somewhat exist today, making very expensive forks, knives, and spoons. Oneida. It's the same company that makes very expensive silverware today. So whenever you're eating with your silverware, this Oneida, just imagine the things that they did in their utopian society with each other. The last utopia you should know is Brook Farm. This was led by Charles Fourier. And this was a transcendentalist utopia. It's also kind of a oxymoron, because it was a community that tried to promote individualism. Think about that for a second. It was a community that tried to promote individualism. hey guys, let's all work together to become individualistic. What? The idea was that we were supposed to try to support each other in finding our own individual truths as a community. Which doesn't really make sense to me, but it made sense to them. And I guess it does work out. It'd be like, hey, so go off into the forest. We'll check on you every so often to make sure you have food. All right, good luck with your journey. And then we'll come back and make sure you're alive in like 3 weeks. And then they do that. But again, they attracted transcendentalists. Again, they were trying to find truth, try to stay away from society, all those things. So folks, again, going back to this question, you've already written this down. You have to write it down again. In what ways does the Second Great Awakening in the North influence two of the following? Did the Second Great Awakening influence abolition? Of course, this idea of doing good work. So if you want to go to heaven, should you try freeing slaves? That would be good. That might win you a lot of points, right? If you want to go to heaven, like, hey, God, I freed like 30 slaves. Like, oh, whoa, go on in. Temperance, trying to help society around you. God, I just, I stopped like 90 people drinking. Oh, it's amazing. Come on in. Cult of domesticity. This one's less about religion and more just about empowering women, though, right? The idea is that women felt more empowered in the church, so that they feel more empowered to fix their own lives. So that's the cult of domesticity. And in utopian communities, we can find a perfect society through religion. Let's try it out in real practice in the world around us. So, be familiar with those four. That, folks, is Unit 4.